December 13th, 1976, Largo, Florida. It's a Monday night around 8 p.m. Carol Hutto tells her mother that she's going to her friend Denise's house. She would tell her mother that she would return home at 10 p.m. Carol meets Denise. Then she leaves and tells Denise that she's stopping at the convenience store in case her mother calls, asking about her whereabouts. However, Carol never makes it home. At 11 p.m., Carol's half-brother Jerry returns home from being out. Norma Hutto, Carol's mother, asks Jerry if he had seen Carol. Norma then calls Denise, asking if Carol was there, thinking maybe she just lost track of time. But Denise said that she had left a while ago. By 2 a.m., the Huttos called the police to report her missing, but in 1976, the police tell her to wait 24 hours before reporting her missing to see if she returns home. Welcome to the campfire. Grab your s'mores and grab a seat around the campfire. I am your host, Kevin. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. Thanks for joining tonight as we gather around the fire as we get into the case of Carol Hutto. Before we get into the case tonight, I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online, so you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. All right, guys. So the night of the 13th, Carol goes missing. And the police tell the Huttos to wait 24 hours before to report her missing. So the next morning, Carol's best friend, Lee Nicolay, arrives at the house to pick her up for school, but there was no sign of Carol, and Lee heads off to school. So while at school, Lee is told to report to the Dean of Girls' office, where she meets the dean and Carol's mother, Norma. Now, at this point, Norma is upset because Carol's still missing, and the dean asks if she knows where Carol is, and is even accused at first of covering for Carol while in the dean's office by the dean. So this is how close Lee and the Huttos are. Lee refers Norma as Mom, and at this point, Lee is starting to get upset and asks Norma what's going on. That's when Norma explains to Lee that Carol never returned home from the night before and is missing and nobody knows where she is. So Lee helps the Huttos look for Carol and joins in the search. And in the 70s, CBs were a big thing for teenagers, not just truckers and first responders, to have and use and talk to on all of the time. Even when I was in high school, I had a CB radio in my truck that I used all of the time as well. So Lee's handle was Blondie, and Carol's handle was Wonder Woman, where she would call her on the CB to try and get her 20. Now, a 20 was CB code for what's your location. Fun fact, the 10 codes that law enforcement and first responders used back in the day was on CB code lingo to disguise what they would be talking about in reference to the calls that they were going on. Because before trunking radios were a thing, they would communicate by CB radio, and the emergency channel was channel 9, and it was easy for just anyone to tune into channel 9 and listen in on it. Eventually, the 10 codes would phase out, and it was like mid-2000s, 2006, 7 range, was when they were starting to phase out, but people still used them. And that was because new law enforcement, new first responders that were coming out into the field, they weren't training those in their training. So when older generations used 10 codes, the younger generation had no idea what they were talking about. So Lee would ask anyone on the CB network if they had seen Carol, with no luck, and Carol's parents, Jerry, who is Carol's half-brother, and Lee were all walking on foot searching the area looking for Carol. Later that day, around 4 p.m., Jerry went to the lake, which is a muddy, swampy area that is located behind a new set of houses that was under construction, and spots something bulky and in the murky water. He can't see the face, but he does see a piece of clothing above the water that he recognizes as Carol's clothing. So at this point, Jerry is a little freaked out, and he races home to tell his parents what he found and also to call the police. According to police reports, Carol was weighted down with pieces of concrete to keep the body submerged underwater, and her body was only partially clothed, being naked from the waist down. The lake that her body was found in was relatively close to her home, according to reports, and it was only about a block, maybe a little further, from the Hutto residence. The lake is also located near the Keene Shopping Center. Investigators canvassing the scene that evening come to the conclusion that Carol was murdered, and then her body was placed in the swampy lake, because they found what appeared to be heel marks along the ground where the body was dragged from. The heel marks would lead detectives to a house that was under construction that was nearby where the body was found. When investigators get to the house, they find a fireplace in the house that was recently used. The floor was bare concrete, where there was a piece of cardboard that was laid on the floor, and a 2x4 also that was nearby with blood on it that they thought may have been the murder weapon. While searching the house, investigators found the rest of Carol's clothing that consisted of her jeans, a windbreaker, and underwear. Also found at the scene was a pair of tin snips. After processing the scene, investigators take a look at Carol's body, which would have appeared to have chemical burns on the center of her chest as well as her right side. Her body is showing signs of rigor mortis, which tells investigators that it was probably about 12 hours since Carol had died. Also, Carol's watch had stopped at 10:36 p.m., which gives a clue of when she died. However, investigators won't know for sure until an autopsy is done to confirm approximate time of death and also the cause of death. An autopsy reveals that Carol was hit with an object and had blunt force trauma and was also strangled. She lost consciousness and then was placed in the lake while she was alive. A rape kit was done and found that there was no sexual assault. Detectives interviewed Jerry, who found the body. They found it a bit odd that he would search for her by such a swampy area. Investigators begin looking into Jerry, who has had a shaky past. With no much to go on after interviewing Jerry, they also speak with Carol's parents, who tell investigators about Carol receiving a couple of phone calls the night that she was killed. One of which was Denise Holt, who lives in an apartment at Imperial Palms. That's when Carol would tell her parents around 8 p.m. that she was leaving and would return by 10 p.m. The detectives followed the path that Carol took to the store and found that the clerk was working the night that Carol went missing and remembers seeing Carol around 8:30 p.m. Police would widen the radius to 2 miles from the crime scene, interviewing several other people. On December 17th of 76, Carol's parents have Carol's funeral. The family and friends gather for the service, and also in attendance is the police. They take note on who shows up at the funeral in case the killer was also there. When investigators begin interviewing everyone that Carol knew or that knew Carol, one person they interview is her neighbor, Jimmy Kinn. Jimmy was a popular kid who played football and was pretty good trumpet player as well. For the most part, everyone had good things to say about him. Wendy Burridge Eversole, who was at the funeral, was standing next to Jimmy and stated that Jimmy and her were crying together at Carol's funeral. So when investigators interviewed Jimmy tells them that he wasn't with or had seen Carol the night that she had died. When asked about his whereabouts the night that she was killed, he clams up and tells investigators he's going to speak with his parents before answering any more questions. At this point, Jimmy's parents get a lawyer, and that pretty much shuts down any questioning from investigators to Jimmy because they're roadblocked by the lawyer. Jimmy wasn't completely ruled out as a suspect at the time investigators originally conducted their original investigation, and Jimmy would remain a person of interest. 2 weeks after the murder, a woman brings information to police and tells them about these two men and possibly a younger woman with a gun. Police start looking for these two men to bring them in for questioning. The ages of the men were 29 and 45 and reported that they were driving either a dark blue van or a 1972 white Chevy pickup truck with a CB radio. Now, with information like that, it's kind of hard to believe the validity of this information since the vehicles are so vastly different. Police would state that they believed a young woman accompanying the men would also may have been kidnapped. The men are believed to be armed and dangerous with a .38 caliber revolver. It was told to investigators that the men frequently visited homosexual bars and also used heroin. Now, this information came from the woman who had reached out to police. So there wasn't any confirmation that these men actually were even real people or were fictitious people. So police would have to spend time looking into this lead until they ruled out that it was nothing. It wouldn't be too long either before detectives receive yet another phone call from a mystery woman who knows information about Carol's murder and who the killer is. So now this would be the break that police were looking for. The mystery woman is Cheryl Moreland. Cheryl tells investigators that it was her stepson Danny that killed Carol. She would go on to tell investigators that Danny and some of his friends were driving in a neighborhood. She would provide police with particular information that police were keeping close to the chest and that only they and the killer would know, such as the burn mark that was between Carol's breasts. So when investigators ask Cheryl where Danny's whereabouts are, she tells them that he would be back that night or in the morning. Investigators would begin staking out the address. What would begin as hours would turn into days. Then Detective Tom Knabb would receive a call from the stepmother who said that he had gotten sidetracked and was at a bar scoring some drugs and would be back that night. Detectives start thinking something isn't adding up at this point when they tell Cheryl that unless Danny shows up, they're pursuing other avenues and other leads. That's when she would tell investigators that she was there the night that her stepson allegedly killed Carol and that she helped Danny cover it up. A confession that seemed too good to be true would turn out to be just that, too good to be true. After some digging, the investigators would learn that Moreland has a history of confessing to crimes she didn't commit. This is seen by investigators all too often that people confess to crimes that they never commit. So investigators learned that in 1970, Moreland was arrested in Tampa, Florida for confessing to the murder of her husband, who was at the time alive and well. So police push on with their investigation and look into other leads and avenues. They receive a tip claiming that a guy met Jerry a few months prior and would talk about his sister and dragging his body to a lake. Authorities take the information given from the source with a grain of salt, as he isn't any saint either. He had done time for burglary. He would tell investigators that he was at a party where he met Jerry when he claims that Jerry had confessed to him. After receiving the tip from the tipster, they bring Jerry in for another interview and had him restate his statement. He continues to proclaim his innocence along with his mother defending him. To help his case, Jerry agrees to voluntarily give hair samples and also take a lie detector test, which lie detectors are admissible in court, but could help investigators eliminate suspects. So remember now, it's 1978 at this point, and DNA testing was only a dream at this point and something you might see in a movie. So comparing Jerry's hair to the hair found in the house under construction from the vacuum cleaner wasn't exactly promising. So with nothing tying Jerry to the case, they let him go and would still have some doubts. Now, this is where the case would go cold for 18 years until March of 1994. I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, BetterHelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's BetterHelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. Brad Hoyes was injured in the line of duty and was forced to take a desk job at the department. The head detective of the department, Mike Short, tells Brad that he's going to give him a special assignment. So Mike tells Brad that Carol's Hutto's case was the oldest cold case file in the department. Brad starts going through the evidence when he gets a call from a girl in Germany who's married to a serviceman that is stationed there. She saw an article about Frank Potts being arrested in Polk County, Florida, who is a suspected serial killer. And when she tells Brad that she believed Frank Potts was the guy who killed Carol Hutto. She goes on to explain to Brad that 2 nights prior to Carol being killed, Frank Potts tried kidnapping her. Brad asked the woman about the incident and said that she was 16 at the time, the same age that Carol was, when a van pulled up and a man pulled out to try to grab her, and she fought him off and ran away. So after looking into Potts, his MO doesn't really fit Carol's case. The way Carol's case was and the way Potts had conducted his crimes, the two never really lined up, and Brad eventually drops Potts as being a suspect of Carol's murder. So while driving back from interviewing Potts, Brad tells Mike that he finds something that he read in Carol's diary, something that was overlooked in the original investigation. Brad read that Carol and Jimmy would always walk to the lake together and spent a lot of time together. Brad was referring to Jimmy Kinn, who investigators interviewed originally, and as investigators asked more questions, the parents and Jimmy lawyered up and stopped answering any questions, and it became a dead lead. And because they couldn't ask Jimmy any more questions, they never pursued Jimmy as a suspect. But in Carol's diary, Carol had a crush on Jimmy and acted on those feelings and never told anyone about it. In her diary, she states that Jimmy told her to not tell anyone about them. In fear of losing that affection from Jimmy, she would keep it between herself and her diary. Carol and Jimmy had a secret spot out by the lake behind the house that was under construction, the same spot that Carol was murdered, and where her body was found. When Brad reads the line about her and Jimmy always walking to the lake to meet there, he knew Jimmy was their guy. He read the brief statement and interview that investigators were able to get from Jimmy at the time and saw that Jimmy played it off like he hardly knew Carol and that they were just neighbors and were friendly to each other. But it was obviously that he knew her a lot more than he had told investigators. Brad and Mike requested the help of criminal profilers from the FBI to come in and help put together a profile of the killer. With given just the facts about the case, the profilers would paint an eerie profile of their suspect. So here's the profile. A 16 to 21 years old male who is athletic, a loner, possibly knew the victim and would be their first major crime, such as a homicide. With this profile, it fits Jimmy Kinn to a T. The problem was finding where Jimmy was. With the help from the FBI Largo field office, they find that Jimmy was in the Navy working on various submarines and happened to be in port. In July of '94, Brad and Mike hop a flight to Groton, Connecticut, where Petty Officer James Kinn is stationed. Brad gets to Connecticut and begins talking with Jimmy. He asked him if she was dating anyone or seeing anyone steadily that he could remember. He played it off at first that he didn't remember her seeing anyone or dating anyone steadily or seriously. That's when Brad tells Jimmy that he knew about their secret relationship and that they met at the lake. When confronted by Brad, he begins changing his story. He would admit to Detective Short that he had called Carol twice the night that she was killed, and the two met up shortly after Carol left her house. Wanting to know more information, Short asked Jimmy if she was okay whenever the two parted ways. Jimmy would tell Detective Short that Carol was alive when he left to go back home and agrees to take a polygraph test. Then the following day, Largo police are informed that Jimmy Kinn obtained a lawyer once again, and any contact with him had to go strictly through his lawyer. So obviously that lie detector test didn't happen. Unable to pursue Jimmy once again without more evidence, Brad looks at the crime scene photos again and takes a look at the burn marks between Carol's breasts and the burn marks on her legs with a question of what caused those burn marks, which the burns on her legs were chemical burns suspected by the chemicals found in the house under construction. He then looks at the burn marks between her breasts and looks at the crime scene photos of a pair of tin snips and realizes that the tin snips caused that burn. So then Brad realizes that the burn was either a test of death to confirm that she was dead or that she had been tortured. Detectives theorized that Jimmy that night wanted sex and Carol was adamant about not having sex, and that was when Jimmy was forcing himself onto her and it went too far. At this point, that's just a theory that investigators have. There's no actual proof or confession to support that theory. In July of '98, 22 years after Carol's murder took place, Detective Short returns to Groton, Connecticut at the Navy base that Jimmy was stationed at to take one more shot at Jimmy. Short would meet with NCIS to have another interview with Jimmy. This is where NCIS would interrogate Jimmy and would confront him by taking a softer approach and playing to the psyche of the idea that maybe it was an accident and it wasn't meant to go that way and things just went a little too far too fast. Jimmy would remain silent for 30 minutes before breaking down. Jimmy would say that they were horseplaying and Carol tripped and became unconscious. He claimed that he checked to see if she was breathing and she wasn't. Short asked him what happened next, and Jimmy would go on to tell them that he took her clothes off and then took her to the lake. Investigators, however, don't buy this accidental story because it doesn't explain the burns on Carol's body, it doesn't explain the marks on her neck, or the bloody 2x4. Jimmy leaves out details and doesn't confess to all of the details, but detectives are able to piece together the turn of events that night. When they met at the house, Jimmy puts together this little bedroom-like scene and tries starting a fire. They put a piece of cardboard down on the floor. The two begin kissing and making out when Jimmy wanted to have sex and she was refusing. That's when Jimmy was forcing the issue and Carol began to scream and wanting to silence those screams. That's when investigators believe Jimmy hit her with the 2x4. So investigators telling Jimmy their theories would begin to have Jimmy admitting to hitting Carol with the 2x4. Then Jimmy admits to strangling Carol and then burning her, and then also admitting to killing her. After all that he had done to Carol, though prior to bringing her to the lake, Carol was still alive. So to make sure that she was dead, he ties cinder blocks to her to weigh her down when he put Carol into the water so that she would ultimately drown. As reported by Tampa Bay Times, it was said that Kinn was under the influence of alcohol or marijuana. That was the only article that had mentioned anything about alcohol or marijuana, so take it as you will. So Jimmy explains that the reason for the marks on the neck and the burn marks was to throw investigators off to make them think that it was a stranger who killed Carol. Not realizing that when you strangle someone, it's more close and personal, and it actually points towards someone knowing the victim. So after Jimmy is arrested and charged with the murder of Carol Hutto, Brad Hoyes visits Jerry to apologize to him and the black cloud that he had to live under for so long as a suspect to Carol's murder. On February 9th of 2000, Jimmy Kinn is in court for the murder of Carol Hutto. Prosecutors immediately sought out the first-degree murder conviction and Ken's lawyers would concede that Ken did bore some responsibilities to the crime. After all, they did have a confession from Ken. The jury would deliberate for only 22 minutes before finding Ken guilty of first-degree murder. Jimmy's lawyers would then appeal the verdict of first-degree murder because Ken's lawyers would argue that Ken's rights were violated because his lawyer wasn't present during the 1998 interrogation. According to the U.S. Navy guidelines, when an enlisted officer is convicted of a crime, then they are dishonorably discharged if and when that person is released from prison. There is a chance that Jimmy Ken could get out of prison and taste freedom once again. Since the crime took place in 1976, the judge applied the state statute that was in effect for that year, which would make a person eligible for parole after 25 years. It doesn't mean that he will receive parole, but I'm sure he will try. Which reports didn't say exactly the exact date that the sentencing took place, but assuming that it was sometime in 2000, then Ken would be eligible for parole in 2025. Which is only 2 years away. Alright guys, so that concludes the case around the campfire. I know there's a lot more information that I may have not included in this case, as there is a lot of information to cover. All resources used to gather information for the case include but not limited to news articles, reports, and documentaries, as well as other sources. I appreciate everyone who has gathered by the campfire with me for this case tonight. Also, if you'd like to listen to ad-free shows as well as bonus episodes and also get a shout out on the podcast during the most recent episode, then sign up and join me over at the Bonfire. You can find the Bonfire over on Patreon, where there are also different tiers to choose from. As we progress with growth, there will be more tiers that are added. You can find the Bonfire at patreon.com/Campfire Crime Chronicles. Also, don't forget to check out the merch store that we have now. You can access the link to the merch store through the website. I appreciate all the support from all the listeners and supporters. Also, if you wish to support the show and not necessarily sign up for a subscription, you can support the show with the S'mores Fund through the website campfirecrimechronicles.com. A link will be provided into the show notes. So join me next time in 2 weeks as we gather around the campfire for the next case that we dive into. And remember to sleep with one eye open. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.